Hey, welcome to Firescale Audiobooks. If you enjoy our audiobooks, please consider subscribing to the channel. Also, feel free to share your review in the comments section below.
Malaya looked over subconsciously and then lowered her head, the food on her plate suddenly becoming quite interesting. She hadn't eaten very much before, and yet now she was enamored enough to take 2 bites back to back. The change didn't escape Theron's notice, but he also didn't look over for more than a glance. One would have never thought he had spotted his target. Given where they were tucked into the restaurant, Sawyer and Yanaway didn't notice them either, nor did the third individual with them. This was the same trio that had been together in the tea house before. "I'm going to go to the bathroom, Malaya. I'll be right back." Malaya blinked. Right. Take your time." She cleared her throat, her ears turning red again, wondering why she had told him to take his time. It wasn't as though he was a lady. Had she made it weird again? Theron slipped into the bathroom, his kind, amiable smile giving way to an indifferent placidity. The plumbing situation in high-ranking cities like this one was excellent, as was the ventilation. Private rooms upstairs all had their own bathrooms, while on the bottom floor here, everyone shared a communal bathroom, or rather 2 of them, one male, the other female. All of them had the same flaw to exploit. They shared a ventilation channel. Going from one bathroom to the next through the ducts was actually quite easy. Theron went to the private stall and opened the door. His foot tapped at the toilet, and a glob of water shot out from a bowl. With a point of his fingers, he sent it into the vents. It was a common misconception that sound didn't travel well in water. In fact, it traveled far better through water, especially warm water, than it did in air. Theron snapped his fingers, and the ball of water vanished completely. "Where the hell are the women?" Yanaway collapsed on a couch, kicking his feet up. "Aren't you the one who said all the girls in town were boring? Well, aren't they? Have you seen the senior sisters at the sect? There's something about cultivation that just makes a woman." Yanaway wiped his lips before he started drooling. "Why don't you make it to Silvermancy first? Then you can start dreaming about those senior sisters. Right now, they'd cut it off before you even knew what happened. You Kai." "Sawyer." "Yes, big bro." Sawyer stood to his feet. "Drinks. Women. Chop chop." Sawyer rolled his eyes but obliged anyway. The standing between the 2 wasn't large enough for one of them to be ordered around like the other's lapdog. But for certain reasons, Sawyer chose to oblige. "Why is he like that?" Kai asked after Sawyer vanished. "The little rat needs help making up for his lost credits." "Who asked him to be a fool? The thistle name is only as good as the one holding it. If he couldn't hack it, he shouldn't have pissed off the wrong person." "Didn't that teacher get canned?" "She's canned, sure. But she's already a gold man, sir, and what is he? He wasn't good enough to make it into the sex, and he's doing the academic stream because he's not good enough for the military stream. If he can't even pass the academic stream, he's going to spend the rest of his life under everyone's boot. And what are we supposed to do about that? Someone may or may not have let it slip that it was possible to get extra credit by helping his sect out. Someone, okay, maybe it was me." Kai burst out into laughter. "Was it possible to get credit through the sects?" "Yes, but if you could do that, you could definitely get a passing score all on your own. In fact, you'd probably be well on your way to perfect credits. It was like banking on getting 3 extra credits like Theron had. If you were that excellent a student, barely graduating wouldn't even be in your cards to begin with." "Speaking of which, we still have no information?" Kai asked. "Nope. They just told us to wait around here. Don't bulls *** me, Thistle. You definitely know something." Yanaway chuckled. "Maybe. Spill. All I can say is that it's related to the new dean." "You mean your father?" "I will have to pretend I didn't hear that." Yanaway closed his eyes with a smile. "You've got to give me more than that. I really don't know much. Just tell me what you can before the idiot comes back. If you can't figure it out with what I've already told you, maybe you and the idiot are already in cahoots." Kai threw a pillow across the room, and Yanaway laughed. Theron listened to the conversation for as long as he could. After a long while, he stood to his feet, his thoughts swirling. He was never going to try and execute a mission this important on the first night he got a chance. That was the mark of either a foolish assassin or an all-powerful one, and he was neither. After flushing the toilet, he left the stall and walked to the mirror to wash his hands. He stared at the young boy looking into his soul as he slowly pieced something together. Today, he had confirmed that Dean Vermouth had been replaced with Dean Thistle, but this Dean Thistle happened to be the father of a target of assassination. Why? And how much influence did the Thistles also have on the sect that a change to the Imperial Scholar Academy would be tied to their movements like this? Malaya implied that there would be changes soon. The military stream. Could it be related? But there was an elephant in the room. How could the Crown allow the Thistles to move so much of their weight around like this? The next day, Theron learned that change was indeed coming. From today on, graduating Imperial Scholars will be required to complete at least 11 credits of the opposite stream. Theron sat in the midst of the class along with everyone else. Though he didn't show it, he was quite surprised by this change as well. 11 credits weren't a lot, but it depended on how you looked at it. If one considered those who were already close to graduating and suddenly had this requirement thrust on their laps, it was devastating. It was also particularly bad for those without any talent for the military stream. The military stream wasn't entirely combat. It also included commanding and military tactics. However, the academic stream covered the bulk of those classes, while the ones unique to the military stream were upper year classes that had a laundry list of prerequisites to clear first. Teacher Burn Thistle tapped his cane on the ground twice, and the hushed murmurs came to a lulling stop. I will be taking you all to get a taste of the military stream today. Call a field trip. Come on, up and at him. Theron, I'm nervous. A small voice came from Theron's side, her little hands tugging on his sleeve. Little Sadie didn't know what to do with herself. She had joined the academic stream to avoid combat, but now she was being forced into it. It'll be okay, Theron said with a smile, rubbing her head. Not every class available to you right now requires combat. There are weapon cleaning and assembly classes, movement technique classes, formation deciphering classes. It's possible to get the credits you need without fighting anyone. Sadie's eyes lit up, her pigtails bouncing. Really? Really? Theron looked up, sensing a gaze on him. Teacher Burn Thistle had sent a toothy grin his way. With a nod, Theron returned the greeting calmly. It wasn't long before the class was taken to a dusty training field. Grunts and the sound of sharpening blades swirled through the air. Compared to the prim and proper academic stream students, those in the military stream seemed much more rambunctious. Most didn't even follow proper school dress code. What kicked up these preppy boys to this neck of the woods? A young man with a belly as round and hard as a wok and a chest that looked carved from twisting steel wires set down a heavy stone with a bang. Theron recognized him at a glance. He was Wazian, a second-year flux mancer who had accumulated 19 credits. All things considered, he was ahead of schedule and well on his way to graduating. But he was also a bit of a meathead. His credits were only so low because he had barely passed his auxiliary classes. By Theron's calculations, he would have at least 24 credits if he put in a little more effort on that front. Line up. A roar came before Wazian could get his answer. In a rare showing, the military stream Imperial Scholars displayed actual discipline, rushing to their places and dropping whatever they were doing. Soon, they had lined up just like the academic stream students had. A bald man who stood 7 feet tall strolled into the dusty arena. He had a smoldering heat to him, almost as though his bronze skin had just come fresh out of the forge. His gaze was no less intense, and Theron was fairly certain he saw some of the military stream students trembling in terror. In one moment, they were carefree and full of life, and in the next, they didn't dare to breathe too loudly. Sergeant Dulcow. It was said that he didn't like being called teacher at all. When you were under his tutelage, you were already in the military. You either fell in line, or you'd be wrapped up in so many military law punishments that you'd forget which way was up and which was down. Teacher Burn Thistle walked over to the man as only an old man could, slow and laboring. After whispering something to him, Sergeant Dulcow couldn't help but frown. This was not the plan. Burn didn't reply, only giving a light smile in return. Theron couldn't hear exactly what was happening, but he read the body language quite well. He looked away, and though his expression didn't change, Whatever respect he had for Sergeant Dulcow was flushed away in the same toilet he used last night. The sergeant cleared his throat. What you all might not know is that the 11 credits you must accumulate this time will be different from the norm. The point of this exchange is to ensure that both streams gain experience from the other, and as such, you cannot expect to complete the same sort of class as you would in your normal stream and make it past. Today, we will give you a taste of the military stream, a small bit of what we do every day. Sparring. Sergeant Dulcow waved a hand. Wazian. Yes, sir. The wok-bellied teen stumbled up. He couldn't have been a day over 15 years old, yet he looked like he was another year or two from 40. Maybe Sergeant Dulcow had influenced him, but his clean-shaven head certainly didn't help. You'll be our guinea pig for the day. Show the academic stream the strength of the military stream. But remember that these are your fellow classmates. Yes, sir. Wazian greedily rubbed his thick fingers together, scanning through the class of academics with a wide grin. Ah, Theron, Teacher Byrne called out. These brutes seem to think that size is all that matters. Why don't you go and spar a round or two with him? Okay, Theron said calmly. He felt a strong tug at his arm. The last thing little Sadie wanted to do was let go of his hand. But Theron just reassured her with a smile and stepped out onto the field. Theron wasn't granted a weapon, and he knew it would be a waste of time to ask for one. Now he, a watermancer stuck in the middle of a dusty field, was somehow supposed to spar with a fluxmancer with an iron body. A fantastic exchange, indeed. Theron stood in silence, winds blowing across the field and kicking up dust. It was hard to tell what he was thinking as he stood there, a full head shorter than the young man across from him and 3 times narrower. At least in terms of size, it was a complete mismatch. In the crowd of academics, Sawyer sneered. It wasn't hard, even for an idiot like him, to tell why Theron was out there. What he didn't like was that the young boy had the same annoyingly calm expression. Sawyer really wanted to know just how long he could keep that up for. Wazian wasn't just a second-year fluxmancer. He was also a 6th Resonance Bronzemancer. That was already well ahead of schedule for his age, even in a sect, let alone here. By comparison, Theron was only in the 4th Resonance, and he was a watermancer to boot. If you're... A moment, please, Teacher Dulcow, Theron interrupted. The sergeant froze, and the military stream students straightened up just a little bit more. The last person to call Dulcow teacher had been made to run 100 laps around the field. That sounded like an arbitrarily high number, and that was because it was. They only made it to 27 before they passed out from heat exhaustion and were taken to the infirmary. Theron didn't seem to realize the change in the environment, though. Since this is a spar, shouldn't we have a goal? It hardly seems appropriate to continue until one of us is incapacitated, but there are no arena boundaries here, and Teacher Dulcow hasn't set a goal or achievement to reach either. For the sake of safety, I think we should do this first. Silence fell. There was nothing wrong with Theron's words. They were only natural, in fact. But they all couldn't help but look toward the sergeant nonetheless. After a moment, Dulcow raised a foot and stomped down. There was a rush of mana, and a perfect square appeared around the two, dug right into the ground. A step out is considered a loss. If that's... Sorry, Teacher Dulcow. Just one more matter. According to the student handbook, demonstrations such as this one, especially in the case of a teacher requiring a student to risk life and harm, should come with adequate compensation as well. In this case, it's a first year being made to battle against a second, and it should be qualified for the maximal benefits. Theron raised his fingers. 3 military stream credits. Sergeant Dulcow's eyes bulged, smoke billowing from his head. Once again, there was nothing that Theron had said that was wrong. It was inappropriate for a first year to be asked to spar with a second, let alone one from a completely different stream. Dulcow had sent out a second year, because it didn't make sense to send out a first year for a demonstration to begin with. He never thought that Byrne would send out a first year. After a long while, the sergeant nodded. No credit for a loss. 1 credit for lasting 3 minutes. 2 credits for landing a significant blow. 3 credits for a victory. Hey, I don't get any credits. Wazian asked. Sergeant Dulcow looked over with a gaze that could kill, and Wazian immediately shut up, not daring to say another word. Is that satisfactory? The sergeant asked. Yes, Theron nodded. Good. On my signal, you will begin. Dulcow raised a hand, and everyone seemed to hold their breath. With a flap of his robes, it descended. Wazian opened his arms wide, charging at Theron as though to hug him to death. Theron looked back to the line behind him and then ahead again. In just a brief instant, Wazian had already crossed over half the distance, his arms bulging as he began to bring them together. The thunderous flood of blood filled the stage, Wazian's vigorous flux mana rushing through his veins. Little Sadie covered her eyes, unable to look. It felt like they were watching a bull rush a toddler, and somehow it was all sanctioned. Theron, though, seemed the calmest of them all. Even now, he was trying to decide whether he should lose or not. Wazian was suddenly no more than 3 meters away, and Theron's eyes did one final sweep, landing on Byrne. The old man's yellow grin was still plastered onto his face. From a third party's perspective, he looked like he was cheering his students on, but Theron could practically feel the oozing sliminess. It seemed that without Teacher Fern here, this was his life now. Dodom. Wazian's speed hit its peak just as he reached Theron, his arms smashing together into a strong current. Shrieks came from the academic stream as Theron was swallowed whole. From the vantage point of the majority, all they could see was Wazian's back, while Theron's small frame was enveloped by the enormous second year. However, Wazian felt like he had just hit nothing but air. No, he had hit an odd mist. He hopped on one foot, confusion coloring his features as he ground to a stop. The look would have been quite comedic if he wasn't looking around so seriously. Then a strong kick came from his back. He hardly stumbled forward, his body only taking another 2 steps, and only because he was off balance to begin with. With a quick spin, he turned to meet his enemy, but Theron was already pointing down at the ground in front of him. As if I would fall for that, Wazian growled, gearing up to attack again. You're out of bounds. I would advise you not to attack. Otherwise, you could earn yourself a credit demerit. Wazian froze. After saying his piece, Theron calmly walked to the side, the last bits of mist in the air being sucked into his water bottle as he took a refreshing sip. Of course, he had no need for this water bottle to cast Touch a Mirage. His watermancy might be weak in resonance, but his control was at a level these people couldn't fathom. Still, they didn't need to know that. Theron walked back to the group of academics and took his spot. Little Sadie looked like she was about to jump out of her shoes, her pigtails bouncing. Luckily, she was aware enough of the situation they were in to not make much of a sound. No one but the Goldmancers and upper years seemed to quite understand what happened. Theron's usage of Touch a Mirage had clearly touched the adept boundary already. To cast a watermancy movement technique in such a heated atmosphere, without much room or time to work with, well, it spoke for itself. Was it just a trick? You could argue that. In fact, it would be hard to refute. But when it came to battles, there was no such thing as fairness. Wazian stood in embarrassment, still not quite believing that he had lost just like that. He didn't even get the chance to display his abilities. The sound of a slow clapping echoed. Everyone looked over to find Teacher Byrne Thistle happily bringing his hands together, balancing his cane against his body. A wonderful display, truly. You've done us proud, Theron. 3 credits well earned. I think this might be some sort of record. A first year, not even halfway through the year, with 18 credits already. Several eyes landed on Theron. Thank you for your praise, Teacher Thistle. Theron lowered his head in acknowledgement. It is not as impressive as it sounds. My teachers have given me great opportunities. A humble child indeed. Many can learn from you. As you've seen, everyone, brute strength isn't everything in combat. As much as our academic stream will learn from the military stream, so too will the military stream learn from us. A sculptor cannot do their work without both a hammer and chisel. The finer points, the greater details, they cannot be carved out without a hand both sturdy and strong, and delicate and gentle. The two work together in tandem, and what we want you all to understand as the future backbone of the Empire is that you need both. Teacher Byrne looked around with a smile. That said, the point of our exchange is to learn from the other side. As such, Doing things our way would defeat the purpose. As clever as little Theron is, and as impressive as his win was, it is not in the spirit of our trip today. Of the 11 credits you all must earn, they must come from classes that match this spirit. As such, for students of the academic stream, your 11 credits must come through combat. Teacher Burns swept a gaze over Theron, and you will be assessed with a special grading system. Theron has rightfully earned 3 credits this time, but should he attempt to pass another class in this way, he will receive a failing mark. The nervousness of the class began to steadily increase. It seemed that their dreams of taking non-combative classes to meet the new requirements were being dashed before their eyes. There's no need to feel so down. This is an Imperial Academy, after all. You all are here to learn, so learn you will. Your weaknesses, it is the job of us teachers to help you to fill them. Today will be just the first day. Twice a week, we will join the military stream, and twice a week they will join us. The remaining day, of course not including the weekend, will be spent individually. Teacher Byrne clapped his hands together once more. Now, I'll leave it up to you, Sergeant Dullcow. Whip these academics in a shape for me. I only have one request. Every session should end in a spar. What is the military stream, if not a place to learn combat? The old man's laughter made it hard to hate him, and there was little to pick out of his words, if anything at all. Theron watched these proceedings in silence, trying to gain an inkling about what was really going on here. But no matter how he turned it over in his mind, something wasn't adding up. The only thing that made sense for now was that someone was playing a very, very long con. But could they get away with keeping the disciples of the sects away from their headquarters for so long? The movements pointed to this matter being acute, but there were many actions that directly contradicted that at the same time. All right, I'm so old and muddle-headed that I almost forgot. In a month from now, the luminescent moon sect will arrive for an exchange as well. If some of you show talent substantial enough, maybe you can leave the world of military and politics to enter the world of cultivation. Warning signs blared in Theron's mind. A dog whistle. Until now, the words that Teacher Byrne had spoken were nothing short of perfect. There was nothing to pick at. However, if a member of the Imperial clan was here right now, those words alone were enough to have him beheaded on the spot. To speak of the sects as though they were somehow superior to the crown and the path the latter could provide was worse than a taboo. It was punishable by death if the right person heard you. Theron's senses subtly spread out, and as expected, they were too young. No one seemed to pick up on the blasphemy in Teacher Byrne's words. They had sounded innocent enough, and most of the academics who would have been more prone to picking up on it were so nervous about the idea of real combat that it had gone in through one ear and out through the other. Finally, Theron understood what was going on here. Maybe there was some secret realm waiting to be entered, but even if there was, it wasn't what was most important here. This was a rebellion, and he was caught right in the middle of a struggle against the crown. Theron felt that very same crooked, toothy grin bearing to the depths of his soul. Theron returned to his abode. The fatigue that had been on his brows moments before vanished, leaving him breathing evenly as though he hadn't just gone through a rigorous workout. They had really put them through the paces. But compared to his training as an assassin, it was little more than a joke. Right now, he had more pressing matters to deal with. How should he handle the next few years? Should he transfer Imperial academies? But how would he handle the Assassin's Guild situation if he did so? Should he even bother still killing Yanaway considering the danger? He had originally only wanted to use this as a method to relieve himself of some pressure and gather more information. What he didn't expect was for Teacher Byrne to have such a mask-off moment today. Of course, it was incredibly subtle, and most didn't even understand what they had heard. But the fact Theron understood was enough. Spirit Mansers were incredibly sensitive to the changes in others' emotions. Theron might be good at hiding his intentions, but there was a reason Byrne kept looking at him. His control wasn't to the point where he could hide from a Goldmancer. Byrne could all but read his mind like an open book. It wasn't that exaggerated, but there was no doubt that Byrne would keep an eye on him whenever he could manage it. Is it my fault? The thought came out of nowhere, but Theron was finding it hard to believe that it was a coincidence. The death of Merchant Greycoat obviously had many implications and strings attached to it that he wasn't aware of before. And now, all of these dominoes were falling one after another. This time, it was little more than intuition, but he was being tugged in that direction nonetheless. There was also a reason the mission to kill Yanaway had been at the guild. The same reason Merchant Greycoat's mission kept popping up despite the fact there was a tacit agreement to not complete it. He had been caught in the middle of the storm before he even understood that he was in danger to begin with. If that's the case, then there's only one course of action to take. Theron looked to the blank gray walls around him. With a smooth motion, he picked up the short sword and dagger sheathed to the wall. It was time for his training. Tonight, he would kill. He had taken Malaya out on a Friday. Since then, a weekend had passed. Today was a Monday. According to the mission requirements, the best time to kill Yanaway was a Friday while he was inebriated at the Purple Scale Tea House. So, of course, he would kill him on a Tuesday. That night, Theron left the academy with slow strides. By the gates, a fidgeting Malaya was waiting for him. Somehow this time, she was even more nervous than before. Theron hadn't even called out to her before sunset this time. She could practically already see the sliver of the moon above them. Was it really all right for them to be going out so late, especially in the middle of the week like this? But she just couldn't say no. Last time, after Theron spent so long in the bathroom, he admitted that he had gotten very nervous and had some trouble. After he was so open with her, Malaya, forever the people pleaser, didn't want to be the reason his day was ruined. Now, she stupidly found herself agreeing to yet another date when she knew that she should have said no. They had wasted an entire day in the training field, so there hadn't been any chance to study like she usually would. She should definitely be in the library right now, but here she was. "I'm happy you came," Theron said with a smile. The words Malaya wanted to say were caught in her throat. For some reason, Theron seemed larger tonight. He was still wearing his Imperial Scholar garb, a beautiful, sweeping combination of white, violet, and gold, but had none of the signs of wear and tear from the earlier hardship. None of them had gotten a chance to change on the field today. She had no idea when Theron had the time to clean his uniform. The thought of him having more than one crossed her mind, but even the academy only ever issued one for the purpose of discipline. Before she could gather her thoughts, her head went blank. Theron took her hand and led her away. Malaya felt as though her head might implode. Steam practically rose out of her hair and ears, her collarbone going so red it looked purple beneath the dark hues of dusk. Her tongue was entirely tied, and she barely registered when Theron spoke again. "2 tickets to the show, please." "Yes, of course, young noble." Theron led Malaya into a theater, and they took their seats as the lights dimmed. The stage ahead shuddered as the curtains shifted. Soon, the night's host had appeared. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a great show prepared for you all tonight." Theron had long let go of Malaya's hand, but all she could seem to focus on was the warmth that had just been there. Half the show had gone by before she finally snapped away, and that was only because Theron whispered into her ear. The warmth of his breath sent a jolt of electricity down her spine, and she almost fainted again. "I'll be back. I'll try to get us some snacks on the way back." Malaya nodded absent-mindedly, gripping onto her dress tightly as Theron shifted past her. How the hell had this ended up happening to her again? What she didn't know was that the boy who left her flustered had completely changed the moment he left the theater. Slinking off into the night, the cold blue of Theron's eyes left streaks in the darkness. Today, there was no rain. That was unfortunate. He'd just have to make his own. "Fuck me. I should be in bed right now," Soren grumbled. "Shut up," Tegan and Thessa replied at the same time in a hushed hiss, and Soren slapped a palm over his mouth. The 3 sect members stalked through the woods. They probably thought they were doing quite well moving in stealth, but a pair of blue eyes in the distance told a completely different story. Theron stood high in the trees, unmoving. This location was near the outskirts of the city. Though near was subjective. At an all-out sprint, it took Theron 15 minutes to get here. Yet, he somehow landed on the exact group he was looking for. It was hard to tell what he was thinking, following after Sadie's friends like this. But he did so without complaint, even as the first half-hour passed by ever so slowly. "Here," Thessa said softly. The group stopped by a stream hidden behind some shrubbery. One after another, they unsheathed their weapons. There was a rumble, and the ground seemed to sway. A shadow flickered beneath the crescent moonlight, a towering mass of a beast slowly inching forward. A gray rhino. Even in the night, Theron picked it out before they did. It was a hulking mass of a creature that had no business walking on such soft soil. Every step it took to press the ground what felt like half a foot, and in the depths of the night, half asleep, it swayed back and forth as it made its way to take a sip of water. Nothing about any of this made sense. A trio of sect members coming here as though they knew the gray rhino would be awake. A beast stumbling for water as though a human feeling their way back to bed from the bathroom in the middle of the night. And then there was the oddest part of it all. Theron himself. The youth had a calmness to him even in this odd situation. Somehow, it felt like everything was according to his plan. The trio burst forward, even Soren showing rare hints of seriousness. Their swords flashed into existence, and it was surprisingly Thessa that took the vanguard among them. Her robes wrapped around her under the moon, glimpses of her silhouette playing to the sparkling tail of her blade crossing the cool night air. She clashed with the gray rhino's horn and grasped its attention, her footsteps light as she pierced at its eyes again and again. The gray rhino was quickly irritated and charged after her, its fatigue vanishing as it realized it was being targeted by puny humans. Its mancy level wasn't very high, maybe just at the 6th resonance or so, but its defenses alone were comparable to that of a 9th resonance fluxmancer. Thessa clearly knew this, as she didn't even really make an attempt to stab through the gray rhino's eyes, simply feinting at it again and again. In just a few exchanges, Thessa successfully lured the gray rhino into the shallow depths of the stream, and its already clunky movement became even more so. By comparison, Thessa's feet tapped at the water, leaving ripples as her mana glided her across the surface with ease. Tegan and Soren rounded the creature's back, pouncing on it the instant it took another lunge at Thessa. The back height of the gray rhino was especially tough, and the two clearly knew this. Watching from above, Theron felt like he understood their plan and couldn't help but shake his head. Tegan and Soren both pierced their swords at the gray rhino's legs, aiming for the back of its knees simultaneously. A howl came from the creature as its skin was just barely torn through. It had been so focused on Thessa that it didn't expect such a sudden change. There was a flash in Thessa's gaze, and she knew this was her chance. Her retreat stopped, and she pressed her whole foot onto the surface of the water. Ta! She shot forward, a silvery glow coating her blade. She's close to silvermancy, Theron thought to himself. Very close, just not close enough. Poochie! Thessa's blade tore through the gray rhino's eye, half a foot of its edge sinking into its socket. Blood dyed the air for a brief moment as the gray rhino screamed out in pain. Thessa's eyes opened wide as she realized something was wrong. Her blade didn't go in nearly deep enough, and now it was stuck. She made a quick decision, hurriedly retreating and abandoning her blade. Wrong decision, Theron calmly analyzed. The gray rhino bucked. By now, Tegan and Soren had both retreated away from the range of its fury, slipping out and extending the distance. They thought Thessa would end it, but when their vision was obscured by the sudden rise of the water, they knew that something had gone wrong. The gray rhino howled and charged after Thessa. Thessa found herself flustered, and her mana control faltered. Her foot slipped into the water for a moment, and though she managed to restabilize herself quickly enough, the gray rhino was upon her, its horn lowered to skewer her right through the abdomen. Without a choice, Thessa could only send out a palm strike, her mana churning into a flaming palm. If she had such a strong offensive mana affinity, why didn't she use it before? Theron questioned. Thessa had been insistent on using the luminescent moon sex martial arts for some reason, ignoring her firemancy. Theron didn't have an answer, so he simply calmly slotted it away. Thessa's flaming palm obscured the vision of the gray rhino's one good eye, and she rounded to its side, grabbing the hilt of the sword she left in its other. Her mana erupted, and the blade became a searing hot iron. Before the gray rhino could react, the sword was buried another half-foot into its skull. This time it froze. The forward momentum of the beast sent Thessa flailing, the horn ripping a deep gash along her side before sending her sprawling into the waters. The currents of the stream swallowed her up. "They're coming," Theron thought to himself. Rather than tensing, his body became frighteningly relaxed. If one analyzed him now, he would look no different from a young man in a deep slumber, except for the sharpness of his eyes. "Thessa, are you okay?" "Thessa." Tegan and Soren both rushed Thessa out of the water, their panic evident as their palms quickly became coated in blood. Pushing down the anxiousness in their hearts, they hurried to bring her to the shore, almost forgetting about their mission. Even now, none of the three understood why they were given a sudden mission in the dead of night like this. But they were told before they left the sect that this was a training exercise for the real world. They had no right to refuse. In times of war, missions came at all hours of the day, and they had to be ready for them no matter what. "Thessa, wake up. The first aid kit, you idiot." Tegan rarely lost his cool, but watching Soren yell at Thessa as though that was going to fix something was really starting to vex him. Soren had a million quippy replies to that, but he eventually decided that Tegan was actually in the right. "Damn it, what do we do? We can't take off her clothes, right? She'll kill us." "Who said anything about taking off her clothes? Just give me the first aid kit." Tegan pushed the idiot out of the way. "Hold her up. The wound is on her side. We just need to clean it up and stitch it together. That should keep her upright for long enough to get back to the city." "All right." Soren rushed out a bottle of water and poured it across Thessa's gaping wound. They cleaned up the wound as best they could, but the blood made it a continuous struggle. Luckily, the sect had their own classes, and first aid like this was among the first. They might have been flustered, but they half knew what they were doing. Soon, they were patching her up with the on-the-go stitches they had. They were basically glorified bandages that squeezed folds of skin together. However, they didn't expect that the moment they stood up, they would hear clapping. "Not bad, not bad. I mean, it is kind of pathetic to almost die to a feral beast, but I guess you can't expect much from outer sect disciples anyway." The voice was muffled and hard to make out, but the insults in it were clear. "Who said anything about taking off her clothes? Just give me the first aid kit." Tegan pushed the idiot out of the way. "Hold her up. The wound is on her side. We just need to clean it up and stitch it together. That should keep her upright for long enough to get back to the city." "All right." Soren rushed out a bottle of water and poured it across Thessa's gaping wound. They cleaned up the wound as best they could, but the blood made it a continuous struggle. Luckily, the sect had their own classes, and first aid like this was among the first. They might have been flustered, but they half knew what they were doing. Soon, they were patching her up with the on-the-go stitches they had. They were basically glorified bandages that squeezed folds of skin together. However, they didn't expect that the moment they stood up, they would hear clapping. "Not bad, not bad. I mean, it is kind of pathetic to almost die to a feral beast, but I guess you can't expect much from outer sect disciples anyway." The voice was muffled and hard to make out, but the insults in it were clear. The expressions of Tegan and Soren changed. They hurried to stand, pulling out their swords once again and focusing on the direction of the sound, only to realize they weren't sure exactly where it came from. Feral beasts were unranked creatures. They weren't considered true mancy beasts, and by extension, they often had simple colloquial names. All things considered, gray rhinos were among the toughest of them to deal with, but they were still nothing special. Tegan and Soren were already feeling quite horrible that they didn't do enough to distract the gray rhino, and this person's words were just like salt in their open wounds. "No need to look. With your skill, you'll never find me. I can give you a choice, though. Obediently put down the girl and scurry off. If you're fast enough, you just might be able to live. Or, I guess you can fight and die here along with her. That works too." The two tensed. Just what was going on here? They both looked at each other, and then at Thessa. There was a storminess in their eyes as though they grasped an inkling. It seemed that they had truly gotten themselves caught in a mess this time. "No? Well, I'm not a patient person. I'll give you 3 seconds. 2. The timer started, and the two reacted at the same time. Soren took Thessa and dashed to the right. Tegan released her and dashed to the left. They had hardly made it very far when both of them tripped. No matter how clumsy they were with their cultivation, it was impossible for the two of them to make such a mistake at the same time. They both looked down at their ankles, and their eyes filled with despair. "Ah, it seems you figured it out. This is a little bit of shame. I don't know what I should do about that, except to kill all three of you. What can I say? It's out of my hands." Crack! The wooden branches wrapped around the legs of the duo squeezed down, shattering their ankles. They yelped in pain, trying to hold back their cries, but failing to do so in the end. The feeling of having your bones give way beneath pressure was worse than words could describe, and it was only made worse by the shards of your own skeleton digging into the soft bits of your body. Deep in the forest, Yanaway stood with a sinister glint in his eye, so focused he almost didn't notice a streak of blue appear at his back. Almost. Theron's short sword and dagger glinted in the night, slashing out at the back of Yanaway's neck. He had no intention of acting for the sake of saving those three, but for the next steps of his plan to work. He needed them to live. He didn't expect to get caught in a political game so quickly, but since this was the dance they were going to have, he was going to have to show the world who Theron Galethunder was far earlier than he wanted. Yanaway's reaction, though, was even faster than Theron expected. A shield of wood appeared at his back, and before Theron's blades could take his head, they ran into a solid wall of wiggling vines first. The defenses felt both solid and flexible at the same time, half like he had just sunk his blade into a net of roots, and half like he had just smashed against a wooden board. Theron's reactions were quick as well, as he slipped away, dodging the shifting roots in the ground. If you can find a way to limit or eliminate thorny fields entirely, using a speed advantage to win should not be a problem. Those were the recommendations of the mission. But Theron had stepped directly into an arena Yanaway had long prepared. This entire bank was his domain. This entire bank was thorny fields. Roots shot up from the ground, assaulting Theron from all sides. And yet, those steely blue eyes glittered in the dark with the calmness of a killer. Theron's blades glided through the night air. He sidestepped and parried, his head shifting as sharp roots passed over his shoulder. Every time he tapped a foot, he seemed to land in an unmoved location, his calculations precise and sharp. It was clear that he was moving much slower than the roots were, but somehow he reacted first. The moisture content in this region by the stream was high. He could feel the changes to the ground hardly a moment after Yanaway had the intention to launch a sneak attack. There was also a very clear weakness to this form of combat. If Yanaway was too eager, Theron ducked beneath a net of roots, and the series of vines suddenly tugged against one another, caught in a knot of their own making. With another tap of his foot, Theron actually expanded the distance between himself and Yanaway. He wasn't a fool. He was only in the fourth resonance, while Yanaway wasn't just in the ninth, but he was also exceptionally powerful within his resonance. If not, he wouldn't have been able to take out a pair of eighth resonances like Soren and Tegan with such ease, preparation or not. Yanaway was also a bit taken aback. He had never seen anyone deal with his thorny fields skill so easily. The fact that he didn't know who Theron was only made him more apprehensive. This caused him to hesitate a beat, allowing Theron to expand the distance even further and slip closer to the shore. Maybe it was the sway of water or the way the silvery line beamed through the foliage. But Yanaway, finally, snapped awake. No matter what, he had to kill this man quickly. Soren and Tegan had already noticed that there was a change to the situation and had slipped out of the vines that entrapped them. Although they were heavily injured, they were still cultivators, and Yanaway wasn't exactly a tracking expert. He had found them so easily this time because he knew where they would be. If he allowed them to slip too far away, it might ruin everything, and then he wouldn't have another chance come so easily. The fact that Theron was here in the first place already made him very apprehensive. It felt like someone had seen through their plans, and if that was the case, it was even more important that he tighten up. A flare of mana came from Yanaway's Dantian. The ground flexed beneath his feet, and he was launched forward by a whipping line of vines. His legs extended from the ground, roots wrapping around his calves, and making him look far taller and more imposing. Thistled bark activated on his lower extremities, and he kicked out toward Theron. The range must have increased by at least an extra 2 meters, and there was nowhere for Theron to go but the water to his back. When had he ever feared water, though? Theron took that light step, his blades crossing in front of him as he arched his back. A reverberating impact shook his arms, and he clenched his jaw to not make a sound. Telling the cultivation of someone wasn't an exact science, especially when that person had as much mana control as Theron did. Right now, it was supremely important to him that Yanaway didn't know his exact cultivation level. So he suffered in silence, feeling the power nearly render his arms useless as he glided backward. His back hit the waters, and Yanaway pressed his advantage. 10 out of 10 times, this would mean that the battle was over. It was possible to fight on the water, but it required depth control, and a single slip-up could mean the end. Walking on water was easy enough, but coating one's back in a controlled enough stream of mana to not fall into the water and lose all semblance of control was something even most Silvermancers couldn't do. Theron didn't even try. The splash of water echoed, and he was quickly submerged. Yanaway took a heavy step toward the waters, vines wrapping around his arms as he cocked them back. Quickly, he became a meter taller than usual, his legs and arms wrapped in thick vines. Thistled bark was supposed to be a defensive technique, but who said that it could only be used in that way? When you were a genius like Yanaway, the methods of use for a technique were kind suggestions. This was what it meant to be at the adept boundary. Yanaway roared, launching his arms forward in a cascade of twisting vines that pierced out at the water. He covered a large area, and with how shallow the stream was, especially so near the shore, there was nowhere for Theron to escape to. That said, Yanaway was also a veteran of battle. It wasn't lost on him that he had yet to understand what Mancy path his opponent followed. Though Theron felt a lot like a Fluxmancer with his agility, it was difficult to tell until he sensed his mana. So, Yanaway's backup plan was also in full effect. The roots dug into the soft soil of the moistened shore. A water bullet suddenly flew at the thistle's head. Fast, sharp, curving through the lines of vines with such expert precision, Yanaway almost missed it. Danger warning signs flared in his head. Bang! Yanaway's head snapped to the side, the muscles in his neck straining on impact. Water! Yanaway was processing things as fast as he could, but he didn't have the time to register why it was a point-blank hit like that only stung instead of taking his head off his shoulders. But it was hard to think straight when your vision was suddenly swimming. What Yanaway didn't realize until it was too late was that this wasn't because he had a concussion. It was because a large wall of mist had appeared around him the moment he slammed into the water with the full force of his wooden vines. Shine! The sharp echo of a blade was the last thing Yanaway heard before his head flew into the air. Theron landed on the ground lightly, his blue eyes frighteningly cold in the depths of the night. He looked down at his hand, a searing pain creeping up his spine. The sword he was holding now wasn't his at all. It was Thessa's. The strength he would need to employ to cut off the head of a 9th Resonance Bronze Mancer would definitely expose the fact it was a Watermancer that acted here, and he couldn't afford that. Luckily for him, Thessa had poured a large amount of fire mana into her blade to deal with the Grey Rhino. Unluckily for him, he was suffering severe burns to his hand now. Hiding this until it healed would be a problem. Theron quickly moved to the stream and began to use Watermancy to pull the heat out of his hand. Dealing with 9th Resonance fire mana, even with a type advantage, was extraordinarily difficult, but he had also come prepared for this. Once he was finished, he began to clean up the battlefield. It was only after he was satisfied that he turned to leave. Tonight seemed simple, but it was all a matter of preparation. As for where it stemmed from, it was a result of a simple slip-up on little Sadie's part. When Theron first met Thessa and the others, Sadie had tried to introduce Thessa, only to be cut off by the young woman. But Theron had heard more than enough. Back then, little Sadie had tried to introduce Thessa as her brother something. Theron never learned exactly what that was, but it wasn't hard to guess. What was more interesting was why Thessa wouldn't want others to know. Obviously, her relationship with the family wasn't bad. Otherwise, she wouldn't be hanging out with her little sister-in-law-to-be in her free time. She had no obligation to do so, and if she wasn't a fan of the coming marriage, spending time with her family-to-be would be at the bottom of her priority list. Then there was the next oddity. Thessa was a half-step into silvermancy already. Theron had already sensed this before tonight, and her actions tonight only further proved that. So, why was she in a team with two weaklings like Soren and Tegan? Theron prided himself on knowing information about practically everyone he interacted with, but he knew absolutely nothing about Sadie's family. If he could figure out so much about so many people, and yet be stonewalled by this quite frankly naive little girl with loose lips, it only meant one of two things. Either her family was supremely powerful or supremely secretive. Such a family had to be at the Marquisette level at the worst, or involved in an organization like Daggers of the Night. Though Theron didn't outright dismiss the latter, often the simplest answer was the correct one. In which case, if there was a power struggle ongoing, and suddenly a high-priority target hiding their identity and true abilities appeared, what would the result be? Theron made a guess, and he was correct. Taking out Thessa was indeed one of the goals of the Thistles, and today they had failed. Of course, there was a lot of reconnaissance involved in this. These last few days, Theron had done what he did best and gathered a lot of information on his own. Though, he had to admit that with an ally like little Sadie, it was all too easy. This was more than just a blessing in disguise for Theron. In fact, he had no plans on handing in this mission to Daggers of the Night. The looming danger that was the secrets intertwining Merchant Greycoat were still hanging over his head. How could he so easily get himself involved again? The good news was that since Yanaway died, he shouldn't suffer a penalty from the organization for failure. Now he could sit back and watch what sort of clashes happen between two powerhouse clans. The Dean is Yanaway's father. Let's see how he reacts. Theron slipped back into the theater as though nothing at all had happened. The gloves he was wearing earlier had slipped back onto his hands seamlessly, covering his burns. He came back to find that Malaya was half asleep. He had purposely chosen a long-running play. Usually, it was a 2-day one, but it was cheaper on the weekdays and crammed into a single sitting as a result. In Theron's opinion, it should probably be more expensive because of that and the pressure it put on the performers. But fairness wasn't something the world was known for. In the end, he had to shake Malaya awake when the play ended. The poor girl was a bit embarrassed as she wiped her drool away, blushing profusely and apologizing even more so for wasting Theron's money. Theron only smiled lightly and said that it was fine. It was his fault for picking such a late show anyway. Theron, Malaya fidgeted, not knowing what to do with herself. She had resolved herself to say the words this time, but after falling asleep, she felt bad doing so. It's okay, Theron said with a smile. I know you don't like me very much. I'm just happy you gave me these 2 dates. I'll remember them. I hope you can find your happiness elsewhere. Malaya froze. Oh, we're here, Theron said softly. You have a nice night, Malaya. I won't bother you anymore. With that, Theron walked off, vanishing around the corner in a few steps after leaving Malaya to the girls' dorms. Malaya didn't know why, but she felt herself trembling as Theron disappeared. She wanted to say a million times that that wasn't what she meant, but it was already much too late now. Tears fell from her eyes, gliding down her cheeks. Theron rounded the corner, the calmness in his eyes belying the letdown he had just experienced. I need to break into the 5th resonance as quickly as possible. My cultivation is too slow. As he vanished into the night, a storm was brewing. Soon, news that the son of the newly appointed dean was dead would spread far and wide. Theron returned to his home, pulling out a pouch. Unlike with Merchant Greycoat, Theron had no choice but to take the risk and snatch everything of value from Yanaway's body. While it was a risk, it was more worthwhile. First, he had someone to blame it on. Second, the items were much lesser, so he could actually store them all. Of course, it also helped that Yanaway had a spatial pouch on him. Theron wasn't in a hurry to unseal the pouch. He was well-read enough to know that anyone wealthy enough to have such a pouch would also protect it well. It was also possible that it had several tracking methods on it, set to trigger when the wrong person tried to open it. If Yanaway was a soul mancer, Theron wouldn't even try this. But since he was a woodmancer, Theron was quite confident. Woodmancers were rare variants, falling outside the usual common elemental mancies of fire, water, earth, and wind. They fell between water and earth, and because of that, wood mana could be partially controlled by Theron. He wasn't very good at it, but he didn't need to be. He needed just enough to nudge the pouch in the right direction. There was no way he would use this pouch after today, so all he needed to do was open it. After analyzing the pouch for a while, Theron confirmed his speculations and closed his eyes. Taking a seat in meditation, he exhaled a slow breath and began to pull on the strands of mana protecting the pouch. For as long as Theron could remember, he had a fascination with increasing his mana control. He had never been enamored with combat, but doing menial tasks with his watermancy had been his childhood guilty pleasure. At some unknown point, he had become so good at it that even without being at the first resonance, his control was better than even most silvermancers that had already awakened their third eye. Being able to control a branching mana like this was a telltale sign of excellent control. Lightning, for example, was known to be close to fire and wind, though more so to fire. It was rare but possible for firemancers to gain secondary lightning mancy abilities as they grew into gold mancy and beyond. However, doing something like this in bronze mancy, especially at the mere fourth resonance, was unheard of. Granted, Theron was only controlling already existing wood mana and not manifesting it, but it would be enough to draw countless breaths of shock nonetheless. There was a shift in the pouch, and Theron's eyes snapped open. He flipped the pouch over and poured out its contents quickly before allowing it to naturally snap shut as though a rubber band. He knew that he didn't have much time, and he didn't want to force the pouch to stay open. So the best he could hope for was that there wasn't anything too fragile inside. Out tumbled 3 pill bottles, a booklet, and what looked like a wooden tablet. Without a third eye, Theron couldn't confirm if there was anything else in the pouch. But even if he had had third eye, he wouldn't dare take the risk. He had made use of residual wood mana Yanaway had left behind, but it had been mostly used up now. Trying again would be playing with fire. High-tier bronze resonance pills, a silver resonance breakthrough pill, and Theron paused on the third bottle, not recognizing it immediately. The first 2 were about what he would expect. Despite the sheer value of the pills, he was quite calm when coming across them. But this last one, I see. This should be an echo pill, though I'm not sure of the quality. It shouldn't be too bad considering Yanaway's standing. An echo. It was the dream of many, and yet Theron's reaction was still quite muted. Upon reaching silvermancy, one's core would not only become more refined, but it would likewise gain new abilities. At this point, some geniuses would be able to gain an echo. Echoes came from beasts above the feral stage, true mancer beasts. Of course, there were many stages of mancy beasts as well, and depending on the grade of the creature, the echo pill necessary to integrate, it would likewise be more substantial. Theron had once read an ancient script that told of cultivators of an ancient past that were capable of integrating echoes through special techniques or their sheer talent. But these days, scholars believe that these methods were primitive and came with too high a risk. Unfortunately, Theron didn't have the experience to guess at what level of integration Yanaway was aiming for. And unlike the other pills here, the fact there was an echo pill was more odd than not. This was because more would only dare to attempt to integrate an echo when their foundation was stable. The most common choice was the third silver resonance. It was either Yanaway was overconfident, his family had too much money to waste, or he was more of a genius than Theron had given him credit for. There is a fourth possibility. Theron looked at the pill bottle. It was a lot different from the others. It definitely came from a different source. The material, this jade pattern, hasn't been common in several hundred years. There was a flicker in Theron's eyes as he grabbed at the wooden tablet that had clanked to the ground. The back was smooth and unblemished, but on the other side, there were engravings he could feel with his fingers but not see with his eyes. Theron raised the piece of wood up to his nose and sniffed. Then, he turned to the jade bottle and sniffed once more. Indeed, They come from the same source. Yanaway likely picked this echo pill up from an unexpected source. Theron spun the tablet on his finger. While it looked very much like wood, there was a reason he said it came from the same source. Suddenly, he flicked out his finger and the tablet shattered to pieces. Shards flew in all directions, but Theron hardly spared them a glance as he snatched out at the carnage. Slowly, he opened his palm, a familiar-looking piece of jade reflecting back up at him. As expected, the jade used to house the echo pill had a very particular fragrance to it. This sort of jade was known as verdant bloomstone, and it had a unique floral scent. This scent was actually a product of its ability to suppress and restrict the aura of what was on the inside. It was used to preserve pills for this very reason, as it was very good at stopping medicinal effects from leaking out. However, this jade fell out of favor for two main reasons. First, it took time for this floral scent to build up and for the verdant bloomstone to thus gain its suppressive effects. And secondly, it was found that over a sufficiently long period of time, the floral scent that built up over time would actually begin to influence and change what was stored on the inside. As such, in modern times, more neutral jades were chosen as the superior storing items. This ability of verdant bloomstone was important for another reason, though. There were special coating methods that could be hidden within the jade. By layering various pills, herbs, or plants of the like, it could store unique patterns in a very distinctive smell that could be deciphered by those skilled enough to do so. This was all to say that if Theron's nose was sharp enough to decipher the pattern used to layer the particular unique scent of this verdant bloomstone, then he had a feeling that there was an interesting secret waiting for him here. It's hard to tell how long this echo pill has been suppressed within this bottle. It's possible that it's already lost much of its effectiveness. But the wooden tablet was clearly something that Yanaway didn't understand. Otherwise, he would have exposed its secrets long ago. The reason one side was smooth and the other was rough was a telltale sign that this jade had been inscribed with a secret-coded scent. The wood was like a control method. Using it as a filter, it was possible to layer the scents very precisely, allowing greater precision and more detailed information to be noted down. Ultimately, the main question that remained was, what was the secret? Unfortunately, Theron didn't have that answer. He had all the background knowledge necessary to unearth this, but what he didn't have was the hands-on experience. He could probably name tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of herbs, pills, and the like. But just like how he didn't recognize the echo pill immediately because he had never seen it personally, there was no way for him to easily decipher the scents used here. I've remembered it. I will just have to find an opportunity to make use of it. I also don't believe that it is a coincidence the jade bottle shares the same scent. This verdant bloomstone must have been cut out of the same piece, and the secrets are definitely linked with one another. After coming to this conclusion, Theron made a series of plans for the future before carefully hiding both the jade piece and jade bottle in a hidden compartment of his living abode. In the same space, he hid away the silver resonance breakthrough pill and the booklet. The booklet housed a woodmancy technique, and it wasn't of any use to Theron. Even if it was, he likely wouldn't use it in public, due to the risk regardless. That said, he still studied it. That was because this technique was neither of the two denoted in the guild's information. It was likely that this was a more powerful technique of the thistles. It definitely wouldn't hurt him to prepare for it in advance in case he came across an opponent that could use it in the future. Theron was under no illusions that he was capable of battling a ninth resonance genius. He had defeated Yanaway because he knew his techniques like the back of his hand and had prepared the region ahead of time. If he wanted to continue protecting his life, he would need to stay on top of things, and that meant entering the fifth resonance. Theron sat in silent meditation. He had allowed his meridians enough time to acclimate to the fourth resonance. It was about time he make another push. After adjusting himself, he took out the one remaining mid-tier bronze resonance pill he had left over from his merchant greycoat mission reward and swallowed it. The process was smooth. He felt the natural expansion of his meridians and the polishing of his core. Absorbing a resonance pill was actually quite involved. This was because attributed resonance pills were shockingly expensive, so most, like Theron, and even Yanaway used neutral resonance pills which had a mix of mana within it. Everyone could control neutral mana, but it obviously wasn't as comfortable as one's attributed mana. So the focus needed was quite exceptional. However, absorbing a mid-tier bronze resonance was far from the only thing Theron wanted to do tonight. He had absorbed a mid-tier bronze resonance pill at the third resonance. Tonight, he would absorb a high-tier bronze resonance pill despite being leagues away from the seventh resonance. There was no doubt that he was an absolute madman, but the determination between his brows was steely. He needed to improve faster. An extinguished soul lamp sat on the table, an eerie silence hanging around it like the wisps of smoke that wafted from its open gate. There were 3 men present in the room, only one of whom Theron would recognize. He was none other than a certain yellow, crooked-toothed teacher Byrne. The other 2 were unknown, but each had imposing auras, and one of them wore an insignia only worn by 2 men in the entire academy. Dean Thistle. Again, Dean Thistle said coldly. Teacher Byrne shuddered, but he did as he was told. His mana churned and seeped into the soul lamp, but once again, an image flickered to life before dying, unable to fully form. Silence fell once again. Teacher Byrne didn't dare even to breathe too loudly. What can you tell? A fireman, sir. That is all I know. There was silence again before Dean Thistle chuckled darkly, the room quaking in his presence. Call Sigil. He will finish his mission here. But Pa Dean, the young master. Dean Thistle only gave Teacher Byrne a look, and the latter felt his entire body collapse into a frigid hell. The situation has changed. Clearly, trying to hide all of our cards and claiming victory at the same time won't be possible. It's time the world knows what sort of talents the Thistles have. The debt of all those years ago will be repaid. Theron walked through the Imperial Academy, practically feeling the palpable heaviness in the air. It was subtle, but the teachers were just a little bit more on edge, and whether the students picked up on it consciously or not, they reacted in kind. Stepping into class was more of the same. What Theron noticed immediately, though, was that Sawyer wasn't here. He didn't really spare this overgrown bully much thought, but he was almost ruthlessly detail-oriented. When he noticed a Thistle missing, it was hard for alarm bells to not ring in his ears. When he noticed that Sadie also wasn't present, that settled things. They knew. This wasn't too much of a surprise. Theron had already accounted for a soul lamp. What was more intriguing was little Sadie's absence. This meant that things were much more serious. Even extended parties were getting involved. Good. Theron took his seat as though he didn't feel like anything was wrong. Soon, Teacher Byrne Thistle stepped into the classroom. His murky, old eyes scanned over the room and landed on Theron. He didn't say anything, but Theron could feel his eyes narrow just the slightest bit. All the while, Theron's expression never changed. Class went on much the same. However, midway through, Theron felt his heart skip a beat. A burning sensation came from his chest, and he couldn't help but narrow his eyes. Why was Daggers of the Night summoning him now? Unceremoniously, and without so much as a word, Theron stood to his feet and directly left the class. The students in Byrne were so stunned that no one quite knew how to react. By the time anyone thought to say anything, Theron had already vanished. A flare of rage sparked in Byrne's eyes, but even he couldn't have expected that Theron would do something like this. Theron had truly vanished. He accounted for every variable when he did things, and though the possibility of Daggers of the Night calling him when he was in the middle of class like that was low, he was ready for it. It seemed unplanned to walk out so abruptly, but he was leaning on his poor relationship with Byrne to execute it. Even with how oblivious the students seemed half the time, even a fool could tell that Byrne had targeted him time and time again. For Theron to suddenly have enough of it wasn't too much of a surprise, no matter how abrupt. Of course, that was just one part of his plan. The rest required a large amount of water mana. Theron returned to his dorm, but no one saw him leave it. Soon, he had already entered a familiar hotel room, his face having completely changed. He slipped inside of the mirror and awoke in a stone room. Theron moved quickly, the burning at his chest only increasing. Soon, he had made it to a gathering room, the very same location he usually handed in his missions. A cloak adorned his body as he moved, taking his place amongst the sea of cloaks that looked just like his own. Murmurs were already spreading through the group of bronze assassins. As far as Theron could tell, only they had been summoned, and their discipline was clearly lacking. An oppressive pressure fell, encompassing the entire room. At some unknown time, a cloaked figure had appeared before them all, nothing more than a pair of burning red eyes visible within the darkness. The murmurs came to an abrupt stop. The first rule. The voice echoed akin to a frigid wind, their spines forcefully straightening as goosebumps crawled along their skin. Never kill your fellow assassin. They roared in unison as though puppet strings had been tugged through the depths of their very hearts. The second rule. An assassin's greatest weapon is their mind. The third rule. Adaptability is more important than strength. The fourth rule. By the guild. For the guild. Every time they spoke out these words, the searing pain in their chests grew more feverish. It felt like a spear was thrusting through them, pumping them full of fire mana and burning their blood to ash. Theron spoke along with the others, his voice projecting and melding into the crowd seamlessly. Today, many of you will be facing your first crisis. The branch has called upon you to complete your duty. Protect the guild with your lives. The words had hardly echoed when the ground rumbled. Theron's pupils constricted. He knew that whatever was happening had to be big, but he didn't expect it to be this big. He had severely underestimated the situation, but there was also nothing that he could do. In his current position, he had no choice but to listen to the orders of the guild. He needed them because they would give him access to information he would only otherwise have as a noble. Without status, there would be too much out of his control. It was only because he was part of the guild that he was in the thick of an event revolving around Marquezettes. Without them, he would be another leaf blowing in the wind. But with that benefit came its risks, and they had come to collect. Why do they only call bronze assassins for something like this? Theron's heart skipped a beat as the answer came to him in a flash. A culling. When an organization like Daggers of the Night faced a crisis, the biggest issue they might face would be internal struggles. Bronze assassins had yet to prove themselves as trustworthy and were the greatest liability. But just how bad is the situation that a hideout of the guild has been exposed? There were too many questions in Theron's mind, but he could only bury them deep. He hadn't even figured out how he would hide the burn in his hand, but he could very well come out of today with injuries even more difficult to hide. If he survived it all, Theron became calm. Eerily so. His ears twitched and his breathing slowed. He could feel the shift and changes in all those around him. The fidgeting hands, the agitated hearts, the slight trickle of cold sweat that increased the humidity of the room by just the slightest hint. He felt all. There was a hollowness in his ears as the ground trembled again, and his breathing, as slow and controlled as it was, felt almost too loud to him. He needed to be calmer, more controlled. Unless he was, there would be no chance. Then he heard it, the circulation of his own blood. When he joined Daggers of the Night, they spoke of this state. A state where you were so focused, so driven, so silent, that only the rhythm of your heart and the lifeblood pumping through your veins could be heard by you. They called it vein song. Theron's fists unclenched and relaxed, his short sword and dagger slipping into his palms with a soft pat. He was the first to move. There was a flicker in the hovering red eyes, but nothing at all was said. Theron was already down a hallway before the other bronze assassins reacted. His fifth resonance, Cultivation, thrummed like a calm building of steam in his body, his steps moving in a flash as every muscle worked in perfect unison. Theron knew portions of the layout of the hideout like the back of his hand. It was nothing but a series of winding tunnels and arched ways of stone. The vast majority was made up of living quarters, while only about 20% was forged for training purposes. The unfortunate part was that the portions he was so familiar with were only the bronze assassin living quarters. He had no way of knowing where the higher realm assassins resided or how deep things really went. And the only way he knew in and out was through his own room. For obvious reasons, that route couldn't be used. In fact, if he was correct, the teleportation options had almost certainly been cut out. The only way out of here was the old-fashioned way. Realizing this, Theron knew that there were probably 3 potential ways out, and all 3 had to be in regions he had never been. The 4th option was that the exit was in a place hidden in plain sight, and that was the worst of the options. However, there was a better choice than hoping he chose the correct path. Go right toward the danger. Wherever the rumbling was, there was highly likely to be an exit. It was just a matter of making it through. Was it smart to be the first to go? Under normal circumstances, no. However, because he went first, the sound of rapid footsteps following him echoed in Theron's ears as he moved. Good. He had already expected this. Assassins or not, humans were pattern-following creatures. When they saw one person confidently step out and move, the likelihood they would follow was exceptionally high. Theron rounded a corner, stepping on a wall to avoid slowing down and bursting forth. Speed wasn't his strong suit. He knew that well. But with his mana control, around these sharp bends and corners, his agility was on full display. His skill in starting, stopping, and changing direction was as good as it could be without relying on a dexterity-specific movement method. Because of that, he was able to stay ahead with great ease. There were most definitely 8th and even 9th resonance experts amongst the bronze assassins. But if these people had chosen to follow him, they wouldn't overtake him even if they could. And therein lied the risk. Theron felt the shift in the wind before he saw it. A thin veil of mist was stretched out before him, every little twitch and noise reverberating back to his ears. Finding the location of the rumbling in these tunnels was far easier than it sounded. You might think you were running in the right direction, only to slam right into a dead end. Somehow, Theron had avoided all of that. And just as inexplicably, his back arched, his knees sliding across the ground with a rough, tearing sound as a blade passed over his nose. The blade turned out to be a boomerang, rounding a corner and beheading a bronze assassin before they could even react. Metalmancer! Theron felt the string of mana control the rotating boomerang, and because of that he also knew exactly where the Metalmancer was. He dismissed his sphere of thin mist. He had already used up half his mana, just maintaining it. Now that he had found the opponents, it was no longer necessary. With a flex of his calves and a double fist to the ground, Theron launched himself back up from the ground mid-slide. There was only one direction to go ahead, a sharp turn to the right. He kicked at the wall, his short sword flashing through the air. There was a streak of blue and a head flew into the sky. Not the Metalmancer. Theron could feel the danger coming from his back. The boomerang was returning, and the Metalmancer was hidden in the back of this group. He had taken the head of one, but there were at least half a dozen others, not including the Metalmancer, and the weakest of them was at the 6th resonance. The Metalmancer is at the 9th resonance. I can't face that sort of attack head-on, but now he's entirely focused on me. He had dodged the first attack and drawn second blood. It was impossible for him not to be the prime target. The wind practically let out a sharp inhale behind Theron. He could feel the sharpness slicing through the air, the boomerang bearing down on the back of his head, still dripping with the blood of the fallen assassin. As danger bore down from the back, the warriors in front of Theron finally reacted to his presence. Pincered from both sides, it didn't feel like there was anywhere to go. Nothing but the steely blue eyes beneath the hood of Theron's cloak reflected any sort of calmness. Shoo! The harsh whistling of the boomerang hit a peak, passing through the wind like arrows slicing through the air. The wind kicked up a rotating cyclone of it, making it look more like a flying silver disc than a boomerang. It passed right through Theron's head. The expression of the Metalmancer changed, confusion coloring his eyes for a brief instant before another head flew through the air. 40%, Theron thought to himself. He was running out of mana too quickly. Fooling the eyes of a 9th resonance Mancer wasn't easy even with an adept boundary, Touch of Mirage. He landed on the ground nimbly and then took an explosive step backward. His timing was perfect. The other bronze assassins were still rushing ahead, many of whom hadn't quite reacted to the changes just yet. In one moment, Theron was ahead of everyone, and in the next instant, he had slipped into the group. Theron's mode changed, and his focus shifted from attack to conserving and recovering energy. Without a choice, the bronze assassins were forced into an all-out battle, and the metal mancer realized quickly that they were outnumbered by far. Theron's gaze flickered when he saw the metal mancer look over his shoulder. More coming. Theron took in the battlefield with a quick shift of his eyes. There wasn't much space at all. The walls were barely 3 or so meters apart. There was only one way in, though there were branching paths behind the metal mancer. And right now, they held the advantage of numbers. But considering the fact the metal mancer hadn't run yet, the odds that this would remain the case for long were slim. A frown wrinkled Theron's eyebrows as he felt an attack coming from his back. No, it wasn't an attack. Instead, it was a push. "Hey, rookie, what do you think you're doing? Go fight." A gruff voice practically hissed in Theron's ears as a hand slammed at his shoulder. Theron shifted to the side, slipping through the sea of people and out of the way of the hand. He was already ready for others to try and take advantage of the situation. No one here was a fool, but he was hoping he would at least get a little more time. The bronze assassin didn't expect Theron to be so alert. Though there was a flash of anger in his eyes, the situation didn't allow them to be so willful. Calculations danced through Theron's mind. He knew this would cause problems, and the odds that these would be the last of them was unlikely. Theron suddenly raised a short sword, a glint of blue coming from it as a boomerang slammed into it, sending him flying backward. This time, he made no attempt to dodge it, his wrist trembling beneath the strain. Even so, he landed softly behind the group. Looking back, he saw that more bronze assassins were running in this direction. "We're still a distance away from wherever the exit is, and I'm no longer leading the group. This could be troublesome." Theron's eyes narrowed when he recognized someone in the second oncoming group of assassins. But he looked away so as not to draw attention. Everyone was cloaked, their faces well covered. But if one was observant enough, it was possible to recognize someone by their gait and their weapons of choice. Theron marked this person and chose to be careful in the future. There was something else that he was worried about, but he could only hope that the worst-case scenario didn't come to fruition. Be ready for anything. Theron sank back into his focus state. The ground rumbled again, and he knew it was coming. Shouts echoed, and when Theron looked ahead, he saw another group of enemies pouring in from one of the tunnels ahead. That direction, Theron's mana recovery pace was quick. A bottle rattled about in his cloak, and in just these few minutes, he had ticked back up to 50%. Then, from lingering in the back, he shot forward once again. The metal mancer was stuck in a battle with the very same bronze assassin that tried to force him to fight. Because of Theron's slipping away, he had had no choice but to engage. Oddly enough, the metal mancer seemed to be a close combat expert. The bronze assassin had engaged in hopes of gaining an advantage, only to find himself on his back foot. A fragrance passed by Theron's nose as he weaved through the battle, accelerating forward. By his side, he found yet another bronze assassin following him closely. It wasn't the person he had picked out before, but yet another ninth resonance master. A woman. Something is off. Why is her? Then it clicked. Theron's eyes narrowed. There was no way any assassin worth their salt would have such an obvious fragrance to them. This person was like him, being forced to come here before she could properly get rid of such an obvious liability. She was smart enough to follow him, but all Theron saw was a pawn to use. He didn't make a move to stop her at all. In fact, he pretended he didn't notice her. In the chaos of the battlefield, with the two of them of relatively small stature weaving through, it would have been easy to miss her entirely. Theron could still feel the senses of the metal mancer on him. His gaze shifted to the female assassin for just the briefest moment. Their gazes met, and Theron stomped a foot into the ground, rushing toward her. They were close. With how narrow the tunnel was, it was impossible for them to have been very far apart to begin with. Theron's shoulder crashed into hers, and her expression couldn't help but change. She didn't really understand why this boy was doing this. Taken off guard, she stumbled, but regained her footing quickly. With nimble and agile steps, she slipped between a round of attacks, twisting in the air, rebounding off the wall, and landing elegantly in a location without the slightest hint of danger. Her eyes flickered toward where Theron should have been, and she spotted him oddly easily. But he had already slipped by the metal mancer without another word. It was as though he had only been there to greet her. However, at that moment her expression changed as a boomerang suddenly came right for her. Just what happened? Theron didn't look back. Those beneath Silvermancy didn't have third eye. The only way for a mancer of the bronze resonance level to pay such close attention to him while stuck in another battle was through means other than a spiritual sixth sense. That meant only one of three ways. Either physically keeping an eye on him by gazing from time to time, a sensory technique similar to the domain of Miss Theron had used before, or some sort of odd bloodline method. Theron was able to quickly deduce that it was the second. But bronze sensory techniques all had flaws, especially ones designed for flux and elemental mancers. It was either the metal mancer tethered him with a line of mana, or he was relying on another sense. In Theron's estimation, the odds that that other sense was sent were especially high. When he reached that conclusion and smelled the fragrance of the female assassin, the plan formed in his head in an instant. He dashed right by the metal mancer without a word, and the latter didn't even glance at him as though he wasn't recognized. Enhancing senses like smell was definitely a fluxmancy technique. An elemental mancer couldn't possibly have progressed it to a high enough barrier to see through Theron's little trick. The end result bore that out. Waves of enemies were still ahead of Theron, but there were none like the metal mancer. A casual casting of Touch a Mirage pulled the wool over their eyes. In the chaos, most didn't even detect the fluctuations in the air. Theron's mana was quickly draining again, but his nose twitched in that moment. I'm close. He could smell fresh air that was separate from a mustiness of the damp underground tunnels. He shot around a corner and saw a sea of enemies rushing through a hole blasted through the ceiling. Even now, they were still making more holes to rush in. The light of day burst through, the high midday sun sparkling with gold through the shadows. They unfortunately represented another dilemma for Theron. The ceiling in this place was over 10 meters above his head. It was easy for the enemies to pour in, not so easy for him to leap up and make it through, especially not with so many coming. It had only been a brief instant, but Theron felt overwhelmed by the number. There were at least 50 already on the ground, and there were still more coming in. In a narrow tunnel, there were only so many lines of sight, so Touch a Mirage worked well. But here, in a much vaster, open space, he couldn't trick the eyes of so many people. He didn't even bother dismissing it after hitting a 30% threshold to his mana. Kill! A thunderous voice echoed as Theron was revealed. The sound of his heartbeat thrummed in Theron's ears like thunder. His grip on his short sword and dagger tightened. In this group, the weakest had fallen in quality, and he could sense several third and fourth resonance bronze mancers amongst them. It made sense. The vanguard would obviously be of a little higher quality if they dared to go so deep into the hideout without immediate support. But even with the lower quality enemies, there were still 3 ninth resonance bronze mancers amongst them. And then there was a fourth that Theron could sense, a woman who wore shining armor that reflected silvery light beneath such harsh rays. She was a half-step Silvermancer without a doubt. Theron could even sense an immature sensory tug landing on his body and reading him like an open book. Soulmancer. Only Soulmancers could possibly form a quasi-third eye before reaching Silvermancy in earnest. There wasn't going to be any tricking this woman so easily, cloaked or not. Theron quickly analyzed the situation and knew immediately that he couldn't rush forward like he had before. There were too many. There has to be something here. He had been forced to act quickly and couldn't plan out every detail like he normally liked to do, but he realized several things immediately. First, for there to be a hole right to the surface like this, he had likely been running uphill for much longer than he expected. Second, from what he could see from the outside, they were in the wilderness somewhere. But the trees were of the same species as what was around Thistlebrook City, meaning they were still very much in said region. This explained the mustiness of the underground space. There was a high water content in this region, and groundwater was likely very common here. Thanks to this, The water mana content in the air was quite high, allowing him to replenish faster than he otherwise would. Third, this space was open, too open. The only choke points were behind him down the tunnel he had just come from, and other tunnels that came in from different regions he wasn't familiar with. Taking them wasn't an option due to the variables, and going back the way he came made no sense, not with enemies waiting for him there. Everything pointed to a single option. The one option he felt wasn't possible. Forward. It was impossible to make it out of here without taking risks. Theron took a deep breath, and the sound of his heart became so loud in his ears that he almost tuned it out entirely. Like a whining, continuous white noise, it became part of him, a rhythmic cadence that was to be accepted, not pointed out. All of these thoughts swirled in his mind in the briefest of instances before he cast Water Bullet, not once, but thrice. They curled through the air, piercing through the eyes of 3 fourth resonance cultivators. Not a single sound was made as they collapsed and Theron rushed by them. Touch of Mirage was worthless against the quasi-silver Soulmancer. But Soulmancers also weren't known for their direct combat skills either. So, Theron charged right toward her, his blades flashing. The rush of blood in Theron's ears fell to a droning lull, blending into the sheer chaos around him. Every step he took on the ground seemed to take his whole body, propelling him forward in such a controlled fashion that not even a layer of dust was disturbed. His eyes darted around, his blade leaving streaks in the air every time he passed by an enemy. Somehow, he picked his path perfectly, passing through the easiest opponents he could find and taking advantage of the one thing he could. He was alone. It didn't matter if there were 50 or more enemies. At most, 3 or so could attack him at the same time. They were unorganized, and more were falling down from the ceiling, adding to the chaos. And the one directing them all in an attempt to form some sort of cohesion was none other than Theron's target. The gaze of the Soulmancer sharpened. She had been paying attention to Theron all the while and hadn't considered for a moment that he might actually be able to close the distance. But she also couldn't understand his audacity. It was much harder to hide cultivation in the face of someone with third eye. She didn't know Theron's exact cultivation, but she knew for a fact that he wasn't in the higher bronze resonance tiers, meaning at best, he was 3 tiers of cultivation beneath her. And she had guards. How could she possibly be alone? Her lips parted and a resonant hum came from her. The armor she wore lit up, and an echo of mana spread through the region. As though receiving their orders, several figures that had once had their attention elsewhere turned to Theron. Theron was still faster. In a flash, he closed the distance on the Soulmancer. A mutter came from his lips, a certain focused light sparking in his eyes as he quickly finished casting a technique. Bursting Water Shield, there was no immediate attack coming for Theron. The fact that he would cast this now didn't feel like it made any sense. However, in that briefest instance of time, the expression of the Soulmancer changed. The instant the water shield manifested around Theron, she lost contact with him. It was as though he had vanished right before her eyes. She reached out with her senses, but they fell into the shield as though it were an endless abyss. Impossible. Her quasi-third, I almost felt like she was trying to catch a fish in the water, but the light refracted and danced around far more wildly. By the time she realized Theron had done it on purpose, the bursting water shield did what it did best and burst apart. A rain of water fell in all directions, and everyone hurriedly retreated. They had no idea what the technique was. Only a fool would casually allow themselves to be touched by a watermancer's water. Unfortunately, they miscalculated. It was nothing more than a facade. Touch of Mirage activated one final time as Theron's mana fell beneath 10%. The Soulmancer jumped, dodging out of the way of a water bullet she sensed at the final instant. But she had no idea that that would be her final action in this life. A short sword flashed, a surge of pressure slicing against her neck. Her armor couldn't even react in time, not without a command from her voice. Her head flew into the skies. Bang! Bang! Theron's foot stepped on the shoulder of the Soulmancer's headless corpse before her head even fell to the ground, his quads flexing as he leapt into the air. He soared through the rays of the sun, landing outside with a deft agility. Water. I need water. This thought consumed every fiber of Theron's being. His mana was running dangerously low. That last maneuver took everything he had. His body was already starting to show signs of mana deprivation, and yet there was still danger all around. The good news was that in the chaos, the oddity of Theron didn't stand out that greatly. From the start, Theron hadn't been able to pinpoint exactly who their enemies were because they wore no identifying markings. If not for this, he would have already realized just what they were up against. Theron had already gotten rid of his black cloak on the leap upward, but he also knew that running in the opposite direction of everyone else was bound to make him stick out like a sore thumb. He took deep breaths, his chest heaving. There was no other choice. He just had to go for it. Theron bolted, running with whatever speed he could muster with his mana at an all-time low. He didn't know exactly where he was, but he just ran in the direction of water mana as fast as his legs could carry him. He was hoping for a stream, a river, a lake, anything. The sun was too bright, and the skies were too clear to hope for rain. This was his best chance. A determination remained in his steely blue eyes. As pale as his face was, and as much as his sweat was making his simple linen clothing stick to his body, his blood continued to pump. Ever since the start, Vainsong hadn't faded away. In fact, he only fell deeper into the state. It was said that Vainsong could only last in short bursts, small measures of enlightenment like rays of the sun at dawn. But it had already been over a quarter hour, and Theron was only falling deeper. Hey! A roar came from the side. Deserter! Another roar came. Theron's mind trembled. Silvermancer. The projection of the voice, the feeling of oppression that landed on his shoulders. It wasn't just a first resonance Silvermancer either. This was a true powerhouse. As loud as the roar was, Theron could hardly hear it over the sound of his heartbeat. The heat of his body practically caused steam to rise out of his head, the drying of his lips causing an even more pronounced crackling echo to flood through him. He had to believe. He had to believe that there was no way the guild would give them such an impossible challenge. Did they want them all to die? Was this not a culling, but a complete wipeout? Theron didn't look back a single time. He couldn't afford to. His focus was on putting everything he had into a forward motion. The confusion of those around him played to his favor, but the focused breath of the Silvermancer drilling into his ears nearly disoriented him. His feet stumbled over themselves, and he tumbled forward. The ground accelerated into his vision, every moment feeling like it took an eternity as Vainsong played in his mind. Focus! Maybe the most agitated thought he had had since this culling began rang through his skull. He pulled on the fluid in his ears, shaking his inner ear and dispelling the odd effects. He rolled forward, not quite understanding what he had just done, but not having the time to consider it. His shoulder dug into the dirt before him, his feet flipping over his head and landing on the ground with a hard thump. His quads flexed once more, and he popped up to his feet, shifting hard and to the right out of the way of a soldier who tried to grab him and rushing out and ahead. With the density of the forest, there was no real organization out here either, and Theron quickly realized that the trees would be his best chance. He slammed a palm into a trunk, dodging out the way of another grab, his body practically moving on its own. In what felt like an eternity to his mind, his foot finally landed on an opposing tree. His toes flexed through his shoes, and he gripped at whatever he could, shooting himself upward. He landed on a branch with deft dexterity, leaping to the next tree. His blades flashed, slashing at the branches he used. Not enough to cut them clean, but enough that anyone who came after him wouldn't be able to trust their footing. Every motion he made seemed to be 3 steps ahead, rumbling thoughts pooling through his mind faster and faster. It almost felt as though the more tired he became, the sharper his brain was. However, that looming aura was still there. Every hair on his body stood at attention, goosebumps erupting across his skin. The adrenaline rushed through him. The dance of life and death had never felt clearer to him than in this moment right here. This is not part of the plan. On a distant mountain, a pair watched Theron struggle. Their auras were entirely undetectable, but the cloaks they wore seemed to reveal their identities. You want to save him? You want a talent like that to die? There is no such thing as a talent beneath goldmancy in my eyes. With that mindset, the entire branch will be wiped out under your control. So be it. Silence fell between the two men. What's the real reason you're not acting? The first voice finally broke the silence. Merchant Greycoat. Oh, he was the one. Yes. I see. And if he survives? He won't. I said if he does. Raiden will most certainly take this opportunity. The death of his younger brother was odd, and he has always been interested in the Merchant Greycoat mission. He is dissatisfied that someone's been allowed to pretend as though he accomplished something no other bronze assassin could. For someone who says there are no talents beneath goldmancy, you sure have a lot of words to say for a silver assassin. The second voice didn't reply as though accepting that he had been caught. However, the same way he didn't say much about Raiden's brother's death, there were exceptions to all rules. The guild had their laws, but they could all be bent and twisted. Just the same way they wouldn't see a thing if Raiden really did choose to act this time. You didn't answer my question. And if he survives? He won't. I said if he does. Then maybe we would have a second Raiden. The first voice burst into laughter. For an assassin, he truly had no qualms about revealing his position. What is so funny? The first voice made no attempt to reply, his laughter growing only more boisterous. Huffing and puffing, Theron leapt from tree to tree. The sound of his heartbeat in his ears was no longer nearly as calm. It was erratic, fleeting almost, sometimes firing out rapidly, and then falling into a lull as though it had grown tired. He knew he had pushed himself too hard. Without mana to actively circulate and replenish his bodily state, he had stamina not much different from a mortal. In that state, a short burst of fighting of barely half a minute would be enough to take everything out of him, let alone now that he had been going for over a third of an hour. The senses of the Silver Mancer were still firmly locked onto him, but for whatever reason, whoever they were hadn't closed in the distance. In Theron's estimation, this was because they were a commanding officer and had no choice but to hold down the fort. It wasn't as though the guild didn't have silver assassins. They were certainly somewhere. From what Theron could tell, the guild was far more prepared for this operation than these attackers were. It was odd to think this when it was their secret base being raided, but Theron trusted his intuition and his deductive reasoning skills. If they were more prepared, it likely meant that the attackers had no idea that the silver and above assassins had most likely already vanished. In which case, this is indeed a culling, but it's also a trap. They're using us as nothing more than a distraction to deal a blow to their enemies at the opportune time. Theron's ears twitched. Water! He knew it was close, but there was something about finally hearing it that filled his body with spirit. He could make it. He could definitely make it. A screeching wind whistled through the sound of Theron's heartbeat. Theron's heart hit rock bottom. Metal Mancer! How had he gotten here? Theron looked beneath his feet, and the answer came to him. He had just picked the direction he sensed the most water mana in, but he didn't consider how the land above ground mapped to the tunnels beneath it. Now he knew why the Metal Mancer was sent forward as part of the vanguard. Using an Earth variant Mancer to open up more passageways into the core of the guild's hideout only made sense. Theron's body had slowed considerably, but his thoughts were still churning. There was something to take advantage of here. He knew it. Then it clicked. Theron's foot slipped, his body falling from the tree as the metal boomerang flew overhead. The ground felt unstable beneath his feet, but he used it to his advantage. He didn't have the mana to cushion the fall, so the instability in the earth was what he relied on the most. Rolling forward, he stumbled to his feet. He could feel his vision blurring, but he bit his tongue hard. When mana fell beneath 10%, it was already at a point of deprivation. Even those without cultivation needed to rely on mana in some shape or form. Although Theron had disagreed, those that argued that mana was life weren't entirely wrong either. It was exceptionally dangerous to be at this level, no different from suffering severe blood loss. Using mana in this state was like trying to sip up the last droplets of juice through a straw. The circulation would be filled with pockets of air, and any potential interruption could lead to a skill failing and severe backlash. If one wanted to use mana in this state, it required not only exceptional control, but a willingness to lose everything. And at this point, Theron had nothing to lose. His mind flashed with thoughts of his family. This life of his wasn't his own to live. Today won't be the day I die. Bang! Theron suddenly accelerated, a smoky breath coming from his lips as his body began to overheat. He had kept this sliver of mana just for this moment right here. The Metal Mancer launched himself out of the ground. He didn't recognize Theron immediately, but after seeing his weapons and sensing the shift of water mana in the air, he put two and two together. He had no idea how Theron had made it so far, but after suffering at the hands of the female assassin and realizing she wasn't Theron, he was truly pissed off. Pong! The metal boomerang slammed into a tree, shaking violently on impact. The Metal Mancer reached out with his mana, yanking it out of the tree. The boomerang flew back toward him and then wrapped around his body like some sort of slingshot, jetting out even faster than it came. Theron timed his steps perfectly. The moment the boomerang got close, he sidestepped behind another tree, continuing to run forward. The boomerang wrapped around, trying to curve toward his head, but the angle was too tight. Pong! It ended up stuck in yet another tree. Frustration boiled over for the Metal Mancer, and he stomped his foot, the earth beneath him shaking as he rocketed forward. Metal Mancers weren't known for their speed, but neither were Water Mancers. With a gap of 4 tiers between their cultivation, it wasn't a surprise that the Metal Mancer was quickly gaining on Theron. The Metal Mancer ripped the boomerang out of the tree as he passed by. His arm rocketed back, his body arching in an odd pose. He reached so far back it almost looked like he was trying to touch the boomerang to the ground behind him. And then he suddenly shot up. His torso flexed, mana pouring into the boomerang as he threw it with all his might right at Theron. This time, it wouldn't matter even if Theron hid behind a tree. With the amount of mana he had poured into the boomerang, even these thick, ancient trees would find themselves severed in two, dying. A throbbing pain on the Metal Mancer's neck fueled him with rage. If not for his Metal Mancer defensive skill, he would have lost his head to that woman, all because of this little bastard. He would have his head. Theron felt the sharpness before it even approached him. There might have been 15 to 20 meters at most separating him and the Metal Mancer. Thrown at that speed, there was hardly a second to react. Beaten and broken, his body on the verge of failing him, there was a sharp determination in Theron's eyes. There was no dodging this. He knew at the moment it was thrown. It was too strong, the distance was too close, and he didn't have the mana to spare to do anything about it. Not completely. He dug deep, casting Bursting Water Shield. The skill barely took shape, sputtering into existence like an impotent amoeba waving about in the air. The boomerang passed right through it as it burst apart. The slowing effect could barely be registered, but that was never Theron's target to begin with. He faintly touched the consummate boundary, but the feeling of euphoria was short-lived when a spike of pain followed right after it. Theron pivoted in the air, spinning back and leaping upward. He crossed his short sword and dagger together. Bang! The boomerang collided with them, sending him flying into the distance. But it was relentless, remaining connected to his blades in a winding, grinding motion. Theron's arms finally gave way, sending the boomerang flying over his shoulder. It ripped up the side of his collarbone, nearly tearing his left arm from his body as it soared past. Blood flew, and Theron collapsed with a splash in a pulsing river of water. When he sensed that there was no metal mana rampaging through his body, he knew he had succeeded in cutting off the Metal Mancer's connection to the boomerang, his true intent with Bursting Water Shield. The Metal Mancer had never stopped running, dashing up to the side of the river, ready to recall his boomerang to take Theron's head, but after reaching out with a large wave of mana, he was shocked to find that he had lost connection to it. In that brief instant, 3 water bullet charges rushed him from 3 separate directions, coming out from the river. He snorted, finally feeling Theron's cultivation in earnest. A pathetic 5th resonance. A blood-red water bullet tore right through his throat, the last of his words cut off. Lying in the streaming tide of water, Theron gasped for breath. You don't have the mana left to be so confident in your defenses. Theron's body soaked in the water. As though he were a dry patch of land, He greedily sapped up any water mana he could get his hands on. Though there was a strong bottleneck, decided by his cultivation and the quality of his core. Watermancy might not be known for its power, but other than Windmancy, it was among the easiest to pull from the environment. Even then, with Windmancy, it depended on the conditions. With Watermancy, so long as there was water, there was hope. This was something the Metal Mancer had experienced intimately. Despite having earth all around him, earth mana didn't have the fluidity of water and wind mana, and thus couldn't be drawn from so easily, not without exceptional skill, a powerful cultivation method, or, once again, a bloodline ability. The moment Theron deduced that the Metal Mancer had been responsible for drawing open the tunnels and forging new paths of entry into the guild, he knew that he had to be running low on mana. Water Bullet didn't have much offensive power to begin with. If he was trying to take down a variant Earthmancer with it, it would be like throwing an egg against a rock. So he baited the Metal Mancer, not only forcing him to use more of his mana, but also doing something completely unexpected in the end. When the Silver Mancer had been targeting him earlier in the Vain Song focus state, Theron had felt that he had an opportunity to regain his equilibrium by shifting the fluid in his inner ear. He acted on instinct and used his Watermancy to control water within his body, something he had never done before. Theron's knowledge of human anatomy was actually quite extensive, though he naturally knew about a great many things. The entirety of his youth had been spent reading about things that fascinated him. Pulling on that knowledge, he had been able to do something unprecedented. But Theron knew that there was nothing natural about this. The idea of using water in your body as a Watermancer couldn't be such a novel thought. It was so simple that Theron was certain that many people had had it before. The reason it wasn't done was because it was too dangerous, and also because the human body was a lot like the earth beneath their feet. The mana there was inaccessible, sturdy, and rooted in the body. It was there for no other reason to sustain your life. If running low on mana led to deprivation, try to extricate mana from your body itself was like pulling on your thread of fate. It was more than dangerous. It was suicidal. But more importantly, it should be impossible. And yet, somehow, in Vain Song, Theron had done it without thinking. Unfortunately, as much as he wanted to consider this matter further and investigate it with all his being, he knew that he wasn't yet out of danger. He had been lucky to use his blood to catch the Metal Mancer off guard and take his life, but there were unlikely to be more mana-depleted, foolish enemies waiting for him to take advantage of. And as fast as he was recovering his mana now, the looming presence of the Silver Mancer was still in his mind. It reminded him that even if he managed to recover, it might not mean a single thing if he ran into an enemy that he couldn't deal with. Then there was the problem of his shoulder. Theron's pupils trembled. It could be said that all this while dancing through life and death, he had hardly ever reacted so fiercely. But right this moment, feeling his collarbone practically weaving itself back together, he was in complete and utter shock. What's going on? Water mana was known for its healing properties, but not only was it inferior to light mana in this respect, and even worse in comparison to special Soulmancer paths, it definitely shouldn't trigger without a technique backing it. Theron knew Watermancer healing methods. They were some of the first techniques he had learned. But they were practically insignificant party tricks, like how he had brought the heat away from his palm the other night in order to stop the burn wounds from growing worse. They definitely shouldn't be able to heal injuries of this level. Something odd is happening to my body. He had felt something off the moment he stayed in Vain Song for so long, but he hadn't been able to think about it. It wasn't the first time he'd been in Vain Song, but it was the first time he had felt the need to stay in it for so long. Now that he thought about it, he never truly felt much pressure when using Vain Song. Not only did it come to him easily, but he never felt that it was rushing him to finish. Theron took a breath, and he realized that as he did so, he had already sunk deeply into the river. How was he breathing? He hadn't even thought about it. He still had half a foot into Vain Song, and his body was practically acting on its own right now. His hand moved, touching the necklace that always hung around his neck. Right then, he could feel an odd resonance with it as well, as though it was trying to whisper something to him that he couldn't quite hear. Theron allowed himself to be carried by the waves of the river. So distracted he didn't notice that the senses of the Silvermancer had completely lost him. Right that moment, he had become perfect and whole with the water. As it passed over him, their mana exchanged seamlessly. The flow became so natural that the difference between Theron and the stream couldn't be felt at all. As Theron sank to the bottom, he didn't notice as his mind drifted away. He had pushed himself much too far, and in this moment of peace, he drifted asleep.